Ukraine had nuclear weapons but gave them up, and gave them up with a guarantee from the US, the UK, and Russia that they would be able to maintain their territorial integrity. So the lesson here for states is that if you've got nuclear weapons, don't give them up and try and get them, isn't it? That for long-term global security, the success of Russia in taking land from Ukraine, if that's the ultimate settlement, is a lesson to other aggressors, and indeed other countries that may need to defend themselves. Don't rely on guarantees, rely on brute force.
Well, but I would also argue that we also have to be careful that for the aggressor side to say, hey, it's not an easy call. It's not like, yeah, we're going to do this, because how massive of a price has Russia paid for this? That just shows how deeply they felt the threat was to them, that they were willing to sacrifice scores of thousands. Who knows what the actual number is, but it's huge. According to sources I've touched to in Russia, that the claim that it's like 600,000 or so dead is an exaggeration, but the real number apparently is very, very high, more than the U.S. suffered in Vietnam and in Korea, from what I've been told. But so that's not an easy call to make, and then you still have the problem of, even once this fighting is ended for the Russian side, now they're still going to have to maintain a hostile border no matter where it ends up, and that's not something they're going to want to do. So that's going to be a drain on their economy long term. So I think when you look at the net, that there's not an easy call for a so-called future aggressor, and most people point to China and Taiwan. And frankly, that decision will be made based on the conditions in the Indo-Pacific almost exclusively, and not what did or didn't happen here, because the conditions are so different.
And that was the next thing I wanted to ask you about, because you made a very important point, which I'm sure is right for all political and diplomatic decision making. You need to think about it in the way your opponent is thinking about it. We know what Communist China thinks of Taiwan, the Republic of China. It thinks it's a rebel province and is part of China. How would America respond if China became more aggressive towards Taiwan?
Well, now a lot of that's going to depend on what the new administration is, what the past administration has said, and it's been pretty famous out there that on 3 separate occasions President Biden said we would defend Taiwan. He later walked it back, but the fact that he said it 2 additional times after it had walked back left that very much open in question. And many are in the United States are advocating, getting rid of strategic ambiguity for strategic clarity, and saying we should defend Taiwan. But I'm just telling you, from a military perspective, that would be nearly suicidal for us, because China has all the advantages in its backyard. Now, if you talk about even spreading into the Indo-Pacific and much less anywhere else, all the advantages come to us. So if we fought China on their terms in their turf, I think it's very likely that we would suffer a military loss. So it would be foolish to the highest order to fight a battle that you can't win, and may end up not even stopping China, because the idea that they're going to suffer losses and then stop fighting for Taiwan, I think is unrealistic in the extreme. So what we should do is help Taiwan defend itself, but be frank about where their limits of the support are, because then that should influence what the Taiwanese people do in terms of their negotiations and diplomacy with China, because ultimately they're responsible for their security and they've got to make decisions. But I think we have to be clear about what we would and wouldn't do.
And in those terms, what do you think you should do in terms of supplying Taiwan with weapons and with weapon systems? Because obviously they've been a very important partner with the United States, and a lot of their weaponry does come from America.
Well, I think that the primary thing, we should to a much higher extent escalate diplomacy, and to try to work both with China and Taiwan and other countries in the region, and to say, hey, look, the last thing that any of us want, and I mean any of us, to include China, is a conflict and a war, because that would devastate everybody's economy, and every single one of them would lose, to include us, Japan, obviously Taiwan. So I think that we should put a lot more effort internationally in doing that. And look, China hasn't done anything since 1949, so it's not like they're on the cusp of, they just are chomping at the bit to have an attack. They want to settle this non-military means, or they would just like it to continue on the status quo, as long as it's not moving in the direction of independence for Taiwan. So as long as we can maintain that and show that we're not a threat to go to war with China, there's every reason to believe that can still go on, and everyone can still benefit economically in the region, and that should be the primary objective.
So, if the primary objective is economic, and that's been something that actually has made China much richer in the last 30 years and indeed helped the US economy, are tariffs going to be a good way of improving relations with China, or does that just become an appearance of hostility, of diplomatic unfriendliness?
Yeah, that's a really tough one. There's no easy call on that because you don't want to say, nope, we're not going to use any tariffs and we'll just go, because then China is very famous or infamous for using manipulative terms and doing things, and stealing intellectual property, et cetera. And those things have to be countered, but there are mechanisms to do that. We just have to be real careful about not making the lazy use of tariffs and thinking that's going to fix a problem, because historically what we've seen is that just shifts the problem elsewhere, and China will find a workaround, and then it gets a tit for tat kind of situation, which then comes back to bite us in certain areas too. So it's a double-edged sword that has to be wielded very, very carefully.